My name is Femi Oresanya. I am an architect. I'm a principal at HOK. We're a large international firm of architects based in Fitzrovia. I've been at HOK now. This is my 27th year.
From graduating at Cardiff University to being principal at HOK,
Right?
how did you decide to venture into architecture and what made you go down that path?
It's always interesting the path that people take. My personal path was that as a young boy growing up, I was always interested in how things were being put together, and more importantly, how they were being pulled apart. I was told by my parents that I had a knack for trying to see how things worked and eventually broke them and then tried to repair them. I'm the archetypal. I played with Lego. I still play with Lego now, but not as much as I used to. And I think you get to a stage when you start to realize that actually I'm quite good at certain subjects. I was quite good at maths. I was also quite good at putting things together. And I then decided that I needed to find something that brought art and science together, and a little bit of research, because my father was an engineer, showed that architecture should be for me. Admittedly, I was at a crossroad until about 11, 12, when I thought that I was going to become a mathematician because I was really good at maths. But actually, I found architecture, and that's pretty much what I've been doing ever since, really.
And what was it like at the time deciding to study architecture? What was the route to qualification?
So my route to qualification, I suppose, is what you may call the traditional route. So I went to school, although admittedly, I always thought, as well as wanting to study architecture, I really wanted to be a rugby player first and foremost. I was quite good and managed to play through my school at very many levels. But then, as always, you get injured, and in my sixth form, I got a serious ACL injury, so it gave me the opportunity to study. And so I got my A levels, and then I went to Cardiff University. Um, my knee got better. I played a lot of rugby there. I studied architecture as well. I qualified, got my part one, came back to London. I worked in London for a year, then went back to Cardiff to do my part two. Got that, came back, had a bit of recession, took 2 or 3 years before finding the right level of work experience. And in 94, I set my part three, and I became a qualified architect in 94. So when I think about my journey, I went into university in 85 and I qualified in 94. So that journey was 9 years in total. But it was, dare I say it, the traditional way, A levels, degree, work, pass your part three. Um, but along that way, as I said, we hit a couple of recessions. And I suppose in that time, it allowed me to think about other things outside of architecture.
What kind of things?
Understanding people, hustling, how to make money, because I think architecture gives you the opportunity. If you practice it, it's great. But one of the tools I think that architecture, or a course in architecture, gives you is the ability to look at other problems and to look at other opportunities. And during my recession years, I did many things to earn a decent crust, all legal, buying and selling, hustling, and also just it made me interact with people. I mean, it's quite interesting that some of my friends, my nickname would be College Boy because I was the green-eyed. I went to university, I came out, I was supposed to go into a nice job, and suddenly it isn't there. So what do? You still have commitments. And also then taught me that actually there are many ways to make a living. But if it's architecture that you really want to do, I was fortunate then that the market picked up again and I was able to slip back into my life as then as an architectural assistant. And then from the time I then got my part three, which satisfied my mother no end because she was always of the opinion, using the Nigerian parlance, to get your paper, you have to get your papers. And for her, that meant qualifying. There's no point going halfway. And I spend a lot of my time now, in the spare time that I have, mentoring young aspiring architects to get to the end of the journey. It is unfortunate that we do have a number of people at your stage that may give up halfway. There are many reasons for that, but as I say, there's nothing that you youngsters are going through that I haven't. Yes, it's not easy, especially if you're coming from a non-traditional background, if you're having to study and work, if you're having to find a way through work to be recognized, to be properly rewarded, and then to get the recognition. There's no such thing as a free lunch in this world. I am, dare I say, I'm the testament to that. But never giving up and staying true to what you want to be. That level of resilience comes from some of the challenges that you have to go through. So yeah, so it's interesting. You've got a card of the Arsenal, which I am. I am a massive Gooner. I'm fortunate enough to have a season ticket there. So yeah, I get to go to all the home matches. But interestingly, as much as I support the Arsenal, I'm a rugby player. And here's the reason why you found a rugby ball. So what was actually quite interesting, and this is one of the things that I think isn't taught, there's also the soft side of life, the social networking, and the things outside what you're studying that can actually have an impact on your career. I was fortunate in that rugby was my sport that I played. I remember getting a job after a game of rugby at the rugby club. I played as an amateur when rugby was still an amateur sport. Some of it's professional now, but I played for the Harlequins back in the late 80s. And I remember a particularly good day on the field, and in the clubhouse afterwards, I got introduced to someone who was an architect. And I said, well, I'm looking for a job. And they gave me a card that says, give me a call next week. I gave them a call, attended an interview, started work. It also led me to realize that a degree isn't the be all and end all of it, that actually that is almost your entry level, what happens afterwards. And so I'm always an advocate, which is why I was quite attracted to you guys when I saw you, that you were in it was at Chris Williamson's inauguration, seeing young people there, because that's how you make those connections. They may not be of use to you then, but in the future, you've made a connection, you'll be able to tap into them at some point. And that's sort of the thing that, dare I say, people from non-traditional backgrounds find it difficult to break into. And so I kind of like, maybe it's my personality, I'm quite an outgoing individual. I like to meet people. Architecture isn't a solitary sport. Much like life, it is a contact sport. It requires interactions between people, between client and designer, between consultant and everything. And sometimes, to be successful, you need to be a good architect, but you also sometimes need to be a pretty good networker.
Interesting that you say that. I find architecture school to be very solitary.
It's funny. I don't, maybe as a student of architecture, but when you're in practice, unless you're designing a small house extension, most projects require good teams. Teams of designers, a design architect, a technical architect, a technologist, interior designer, a project manager. I mean, at HOK, the founding of HOK, the three founding partners, the H, the O, and the K, George Helmuth, Gio Obata, and George Kassabaum. When I joined, we were told about the three-legged stool of what HOK is, and extensively, one was a design architect, one was a marketeer, and one was good at bringing in the project and getting the job done. And that's how, we still, on some of our larger projects, we have that kind of arrangement. Now, you also, it has gotten slightly more complicated, but in essence, large firms like us who do really big, complex works, it's not one person that delivers it. So if school is telling you it's a solitary thing, that for me is worrying. I knew that when I was a student, I remember the level of interaction I had with my fellow students, with my cohort. As I said, I was quite good at maths and science, and there were others who were pretty good artists. And so I traded my knowledge of the scientific elements to get them to help me render. We didn't have computers back then. We drew. Everything was drawn. You know, and I remember my roommate in halls. He, if I remember correctly, he did something like economics, art, and English to get onto the course, and I did maths, physics, chemistry, and further maths. Right. So yeah, I enjoyed designing. I enjoyed drawing. But this guy was, you know, in his spare time, he illustrated books and got paid for it, right? And so when it came to presenting work, I tapped him, he tapped me for the scientific bits, and you know, I mean, he's now, I mean, this particular individual I'm talking about is a very successful architect in his own right as well. So if you see it as a solitary exercise, I think we should rethink it, because you will have skills that others will not, and vice versa. And I think, if nothing else, you need to bounce off each other. What's quite interesting is that, as I'm an external examiner as well, and in fact I was examining most recently at one of the universities for part 3, and the study groups of students in the part 3, you can tell come the interview, those individuals who work together in a study group, that peer study group, and learning off of each other is quite evident in an oral interview, as opposed to the person who just says, I'm doing it by myself, no one's going to help me. Collaboration is extremely important. When you're looking at a problem, you will look at that problem from a different viewpoint, maybe because you have had a different life experience. Maybe you, again, just deal with problems slightly differently. If you consider that you are all of the same intellect, but you look at the problem from a different angle. Therefore, when you're coming up with a solution, part of your solution, and there's a part of his solution, and there's a part of that solution that comes together to make an even better solution. We, as HOK, why we produce great buildings is because we cross-fertilize our different sectors. The Francis Crick Institute, which is just across the road from St Pancras, close to your place, it's I think it's still the largest biomedical research centre in the United Kingdom. I'm touching on that because I was the bid manager on it back in 2008. I'm not sure if you were born. But anyway, I joke. You all look so young. If you can imagine that and we won that in open competition, the design team, yes, there were specialist lab planners. Yes, there were specialists, what we call S&T planners, so they understood labs. But the front of house, we utilise the skills of a hotel architect. The back of house, we utilise the skills of people that worked in airports, right? How the place was rearranged, we utilised our interior designers and our corporate team who understood our offices work, yeah? To create that. And we won it fair and square against all competition. At the time, it was a pretty big project. It was one of those, dare we say, it was one of the projects that carried the firm through when we were going through the loss crash. And we won that because we cross-fertilized not only the expertise within the office, but the different building sectors. It still is the benchmark. A client doesn't just want something that you've done before.
Yeah.
Right? How do you improve? You either innovate, right? Yeah, you know what they say, it's either innovation or revolution, right? Okay. It's the incrementals. It's looking at the problem from a different aspect. I always talk about, at what point did we go from suitcases to suitcases with wheels on? For many years, we had suitcases, right?
Yeah.
And we had porters, okay? And someone then looked at that and thought, what if I stuck some wheels on it? Suddenly, everyone now has it. Still a suitcase, still carries the clothes that you carry, but someone obviously thought about this and thought, you know what, I'm going to put some wheels on that. It's a game changer. It's the same with buildings, right? Nowadays, when we're looking at certain projects, what we try to say is, we're going to create a variety of different workplace settings. This comes on to now if you're thinking about how do you design an office building nowadays. You're going to say, don't know that sort of person you are, but we've started to understand what neurodiversity is. Okay. Does one size fit all? Do you just get an interior designer just to draw a layout, just, rows of desks and chairs and say, there you go, there's the office? Or do you start thinking about a variety of different workplace settings, places which are slightly quieter for those who need that space to think? Or maybe as someone who's slightly neurodiverse that doesn't like loud noise, or someone like me who likes to have a little bit of music when I'm working. I think the skill of an architect or skill of a good designer is to be able to take on board the issues, the problems, and to solve them. So no one size fits all. We honestly believe that there is no such thing as a standard design. And for me, again, whether it's refurbishing an existing building or designing new, you've got to understand what the client wants. It's a specific brief. Design to the brief, don't design to what you want.
No.
My philosophy again is that sometimes we may have a million ideas, but one idea is what the client wants. The other 999,000 you keep for another day. And if you, again, some of the things that I've learned in my career, listening to the client, understand what the client wants. How can you resolve their problem? They're coming to you because they have a problem. They need space. They need maybe to generate value to the project. They have a requirement. They've got to school. They need a hospital. So that's their problem. Now, how do you go about doing it? I know that we live in traditional houses in the UK. They're all cookie cutter. The terrace house philosophy, it helped all those many years, which is fine for residential. But for big buildings, sometimes you've got to just understand what the client wants. And then you just look to try and craft it, just like a beautiful suit.
You mentioned leading on government and statewide buildings.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say the biggest ethical challenge in designing these buildings are?
The biggest ethical challenge. A state building is like any other. I think when you design a building for a government department or a state building, it needs to be a benchmark so that the private sector is able to use it as a reference. Yes, we're using a lot of government buildings that are public sector driven and therefore they come from the public purse. Not all. I mean, we've done some projects which are public-private partnership, still using public funds. I think ethical challenges, making sure that the building is designed as sustainably as you possibly can, trying to make sure it is, despite not having the budget. That's always quite difficult because you're having to demonstrate best value to government. And sometimes in order to demonstrate best value, there may be an increased capital cost on the project so that further down the line in terms of the revenue expenditure, the cost that you're using to run the building becomes low. And I think that's always quite difficult because they may say, look, we've only got X million quid to deliver this. And you're saying, well, X plus, it'll cost you a little bit more, but a bit later on, you will save. Which in some projects, I mean, like the MOD that you show there, because it's PFI, you get your money back because you're in it for the long term. But if you can imagine the way the government works is that cycle, the election every 4 or 5 years, some departments, they have to they've got to demonstrate that they delivered in that time. And, if your project is in that cycle and they're saying, look, we want to be sustainable, but I need to deliver this for this much within this cycle, that can be sometimes problematic. We have the best chance of delivering sustainable buildings with government buildings because hopefully if you're able to do it, you then set a benchmark for the private sector to follow. That would be, so the short way is, how do we design buildings that staff want to be in, okay? And what's actually quite interesting now, because it's people power that is driving the sustainability regime as far as I can see, because people are now more knowledgeable about the effect that buildings, the climate is having on the world. So a young person will say, well, I'm only going to work for you and your and work in your building if you can demonstrate it is sustainable. The government says, well, we want the best people. We can't get the best people if we do not ensure that our builders are responsible. So that's what then starts to drive the builder's solution.
You know how you mentioned the cycles of elections in a way dictating what happens with the buildings? Is there any scenario where the buildings can sit out of that cycle?
It's politics, right? I mean, the current government is saying that we've got to deliver 1.5 million homes in the next 4 years. There's a lot of pressure. Okay, have we started? Unfortunately, there are roadblocks. There's the Builder Safety Act that's holding up things. There's the cost of materials that's holding it up. But ultimately, they've set their stall out. Will they deliver on that? Only time will tell. But no, things do run in cycles. Whereas some governments internationally, they don't work on those cycles. Okay, they look at things on the long term. There are some projects, which is why, projects like public-private sector, or PPPs, for example, or the old versions of PFIs, people would say that, we couldn't afford to, government couldn't afford to deliver them. That's why they introduced the private sector in. Therefore, it is in their interests to ensure that it's designed well, that the revenue expenditure or the life cycles, the cost of life cycle renewals is done every, say, 10 years as opposed to every 5 years. So that means better materials, right? Because if you're able to design better materials, they'll last a bit longer, which means you don't have to replace them. So in that respect, if it's taken out of the government cycle, you've got a better opportunity of delivering those long life buildings. There was always that time, I think it was Alex Gordon that said something along the lines of loose fit, long life. He was a former president of the RIBA. Great if we're able to deliver it, but long life, loose fit means you're not designing to a specific brief, you're designing with flexibility. Flexibility adds cost. So what do we want to do? It takes a brave politician to say that's what we want to do, but then he's then got to go back to the National Audit Office to demonstrate why his building is coming in at 20% more than the benchmark. Sorry, I'm getting a bit political here, but we have these words, we have these things that we say we want to do, but sometimes we're hampered because the procurement, the cost of delivery may be more than what the benchmark is saying. And therefore you come up against, a barrier. How many projects are stalled because, it says, I want A, B, C, and D. It's gone out to the market and it's come back and said, well, if you do want it, it's going to cost you X. Or didn't realize it was going to cost that much. Either you value engineer it or it just dies. There are some programs going on at the present moment where they design generic responses. There's no design. It's already designed per se. There's no architecture. It meets a functional need, but it's aesthetically pleasing. To be able to design functional buildings that are aesthetically pleasing, that you should be able to design to context. But there is then the amount of time required in order to ensure that the building that is designed does fit in with its context, that the materiality works, that the spaces in between kind of gel, all the stuff that we aspire to in the perfect world. Yeah. Which is why, again, sometimes the best forms of architecture happen where there's lots of cash and they're developing, because they then say, we want best in class. You're not being profligate with the client's funds, but what you are doing is designing and then saying, look, this is what it'll cost you. And they'll say yes, because they've got the vision. I mean, think of the Victorian age for me. We still have buildings built in the 1850s which are still standing today. Whereas, they always say that some of the buildings that were designed in the 60s, because they were built very quickly, very cheaply, led to knock them down. There are still buildings which you look at now, and I've been fortunate enough to help refurbish and retrofit some of those buildings. And you think, wow, these guys, they really understood. They were designing for buildings to last.
I feel like sometimes I do think, what buildings do we have now that in 200-300 years would still be considered like good?
Well, I don't think I can answer that. If I looked back, you can see we've still got buildings from the 1700s which are still in parts of London, post the 1666 fire of London, there are some buildings within the city that are still standing. Yeah, the shell, the facade may still be there. Maybe internally it's been reconfigured because we do need to, as we move forward, we need to make buildings relevant. Take, for example, the building next door to ours was built in the 70s. I don't know which way you came up, but you'll notice that it's currently that whole site's been redeveloped. The building that we're in right now was only completed in 2009, right? There was a building on this before. I suppose now we're looking at it and we're thinking, actually, in terms of the way in which we grade buildings, this building, when it was completed, was a grade A building. It's coming up to 15 years old now. It's not as energy efficient as it used to be. The developer or the client, the landlord is saying, "Oh, maybe I should be thinking about redeveloping the site," because ultimately they're thinking, well, if no one wants to rent it, we love this building, by the way, we love it. But you may think in 5-10 years time, if people say, well, we're not going to rent your space because the AC is not as efficient as it used to be, the thermal conductivity of the glass is gone, and we want to be sustainable. What do? Sometimes it's then work on the scenario that it's cheaper to demolish and rebuild than to refurbish. It's all about the metrics at the end of the day. Sorry, tell me about this. Corbusier, Villa Savoie, love the building. The Arsenal, Stretton Croydon Football Club. I'm club president there. Oh, rugby, my sports. And yes, the project that I joined HOK for, MOD main building.
Oh, you joined?
Yeah, so the funny story was, if there is such a funny story, I had, as I said, I got my Part 3 in 94, and I worked for a couple of firms, and I kind of decided that I was not going to work in the public sector. Okay? Don't ask me why. I wanted to work for private firms, and in fact, I got into hotels. I started working for a practice called RHWL that had a team that did hotels, and I loved it. I was designing hotels, I was flying around the world, it was great fun. Then I had a change, and then I took a job with a smaller firm that refurbished the former GLC building called County Hall, where it used to be the Greater London Council offices. That got sold because Margaret Thatcher abolished the GLC, and it got turned into a hotel, a Marriott and a Travel Inn. And I worked on that project for 3 years. And then afterwards, I thought, well, you know what? There was something in my mind that I wanted to start to work for a firm that rewarded through meritocracy. I felt that I wasn't being properly rewarded in my firm. I'd made a lot of money for the firm. I hadn't been promoted. And when I asked why, I was told that there was a queue of people that they were waiting to promote. And I said, well, I've generated this value for you. I've done, I was doing the work. And I was being very successful in the practice. I was being given more work, but you weren't rewarded. And they just said, well, that's just the way it is. And I said, fine. So I remember going to look for a new job. And I remember being interviewed by HOK. And they said, look, we've got a project that's coming up. If we get it, we'll need you, but we like you. And I said, well, I can't wait. My partner at the time was expectant. I said, I need the money. So I ended up working for another firm. And 3 months later, I get a call from HOK saying, look, that job is coming. We want you to work on that. And I remember going to then the person I just worked at, another large firm. I said, look, this is a job. I really want to try it. And they said, why? And I said, well, at the time, it was the MOD. It was the largest PFI project in the country at the time. I thought it'd be good for my CV. I thought 2 years, I'll be on it. I'll get my CV topped up and I'll go somewhere else. And it was an opportunity that was just too good to turn down. I was working on, it was in the news. It was a big project, and I thought, yeah, I can really get my teeth into it. So I joined the team, but I did say to my then senior partner that I'm really a hotel architect. And they said, yeah, he said, but just stay on this. We need the team. We need to get to financial close. That's the point where, they sign up. It becomes a project. So I dutifully did that. We're a team of about 20 then, if you can imagine. A team of 20 architects working on this project. We get to financial close. I thought, great, I'm free. I'll be able to go and do what I want. And then I get sat down. I was told then, John Daniel was his name, former senior partner. And he said, Femi, you have a problem. And I'm like, what? And he goes, the client likes you. I went, yeah, and? He said, he has requested that you remain. And I kind of like thought, I was like, yeah, but I came to do something else. And then, I had to sit down with the project architects and listen, the best place to be in our profession is if you have a client that likes you and likes the work that you do, please the client, there'll be other opportunities.
Yeah.
I remember having a conversation with others. I said, okay, I'll do it. I did other projects in between, but I then became like the frontman for one of the sections of the project. And then as the project continued, cut long story short, I was on the project for 6 years. And by the time we completed and we had the roll opening, Her Majesty the Queen formally opened the building, we were all thanked. And it was, testament to the firm and to the senior partner. He kind of like, there were a group of us that got to attend the opening, and I was one of them. And so that then spawned my interest in these sorts of projects. And before you know it, I got given a different portfolio to look after, court buildings. And then that grew. Next thing you know, I'm a sector leader. That grew. And then I became a principal. Fast forward to where we are today, I look after the government and the justice projects for HOK across the UK and then more. So one of the things that I learned from it is always to be flexible, to know that if you're a good designer, whether it's hotels, residential, or in this case, public sector, or public institutional buildings, big ones, that if you have the skill set to resolve problems, you'll be pretty good. And then also to take the opportunity as and when it presents itself. That phrase of opportunity knocks, sometimes it only knocks once. If I'd only stayed here for 2 years and then left, where would I be now? I don't know. For me, I've been at HOK longer than I've been married. And it's my marriage to HOK. It's been a good marriage because the practice has allowed me to grow, has allowed me to develop, has allowed me to lead. And now I spend some of my time, yes, marketing what we do, going out and winning work, but also bringing younger people through in the same way that someone brought me through. And it's interesting because I have worked for myself in the past. Great. You get to a point where you say to yourself, actually, to get onto the really big projects, you need to have a big project profile. You need to be able to demonstrate to the client that you can deliver, and most importantly, to ensure that you've got all of the processes in place, things that I take for granted now, the ISO 14001s, the 2001s, all of the regulations, cyber essentials, the insurance levels. Yeah, it just opens the doors for us to do the projects that we do. Ideally, it would be nice that, well, I'm brilliant. I surely give me a £400 billion project. A client would say, that's all very good, but do you have the insurance for it? Do you have the resources? When we started the new project, take for example, the Francis Crick Institute, when we started that project, we were working with Revit, with AutoCAD to develop their Revit software. And we were using our project to help them develop it. So the stuff that you guys are using now, we were prototyping it and beta testing it. Yeah, that's what comes, sorry to use that boring expression of, with great power comes great responsibility. But, I used to be into comics, Spider-Man. But it's true, you would not be able to have that same level of cachet as a small firm. So yes, the power comes from developing. The power for me as a part of HOK allows me to continue to push the boundary of what is good architecture. Always questioning when we're talking about sustainability. When we say to a client, look, we really need to make this building as sustainable for you as possible, they're not just going to say now, oh, no, we don't care. We want you to do this. We're big enough and strong enough to say, actually, you do need to, because we can see into the future. We're not going to design a building for you that will become redundant in 5 years' time. It may suit you now, but, buildings, as you rightly say, they should be designed for at least 60 years. So if a building's been knocked down after 30, that ain't great, is it? Frank Lloyd Wright, good man. I went and visited a number of his buildings. Ooh. You've done a fair bit of research, actually.
Yeah.
Have I got that much on me out there? It's okay. I'm at the age now where I'm cool with it, right? You know, so sometimes when someone says, "Oh, I know you," I goes, "Okay, fine. Tell me something I don't know." If you quote something, I can potentially tell you where it's all coming from. But anyway, continue.
You're the honorary treasurer of the RIBA, and during your time at the RIBA or with the RIBA, your mission has been clear on inclusivity and accessibility to architecture for everyone.
Yep.
What would you say is the most important action the industry can take to truly make it as accessible to the public?
To the public?
Well,
or making the profession accessible to all that aspire to it.
Yeah.
We're not where we want to be, or we're a lot further on than where we were. So a number of practices, the majority of practices in the country, they are owned by a couple of people, okay? Like a small little business. Okay, we have entities like HOK, other large firms where, we come together and we're not, other firms. So therefore, we're trying to deal with that some people see it as it's my business. I employ you to do work for me, if that kind of makes sense. You're not employed by a company. Majority of practices are small entities, but architecture is a bigger remit. The Royal Institute of British Architects was set up in 1834 to promote architecture. There were very wealthy individuals that set this up. And over the years, we've broadened it, we've made it more, we've tried our best, and we are trying to make it accessible to anyone that aspires to become an architect. There are issues there, aren't there? The cost of studying, trying to get a job, trying to break into finding work, getting rewarded for the work that you do. On top of that, the fact that outside of our world, people seem to think that we design for free. It's my biggest belief is that we give away our most valuable asset at the very beginning of the process, and sometimes for nothing. You do not get a lawyer. You do not sit in front of a lawyer asking for advice and him giving you advice and then saying, if you like it, pay me. Do you? You do not go to a dentist and say, I've got a toothache, have a look at it. Can you deal with it? And if I like it, I'll pay you. NHS is so. You don't go to a private doctor and say, I've got a problem. He looks at it and says, this is what you're doing. You say, well, okay, if I like it, I'll come back. You're paying for it. So why do we design for free? Why do we give away schemes in the hope that we're going to get the work later down the line? The most important part of what we do is at the very beginning. So we should not be giving it away. Until we stop that, until we stop free competitions, until we actually start paying architects what they're worth, it makes it difficult for firms to pay graduates properly. I know graduates look at it and say, well, you, Mr. Architectural firm, you've got to pay me, which is true. They should be paid. We are a chartered practice. We do not take on people that we cannot pay. There are firms that do it. I personally have a real problem with that. And I think they should be struck off, because we have to, in order to be able to look after the young, in order to allow those from non-traditional backgrounds to enter the profession, we have to ensure that they can be paid the living wage, that they're not working for free, okay? That they're not just getting on their CV. So what does the RIBA do? We have the Chartered Practice Initiative, which means if you're a chartered practice, you don't do that. There are those that do. Again, another problem for me is that the term architect is protected, but the function is not. So it means that you could be a designer and design. Does Joe Public in the street know the difference between a designer and an architect? Does Joe Public know, or Jane Public, by the way, do they know the difference between an architectural consultant and an architect? Do they know that an architectural consultant can still do what we do, but not be bound by the RIBA or the ARB? Now, I'm not asking for a cartel. I just want a level playing field that, we are able to do what we do, get adequately paid for it so that we can invest. We as HOK, we're successful. We do that. There are many firms that are not in the same privileged position as we. And those are the ones that you hear, unfortunately, when I'm involved in stuff at the RIBA, or when I'm talking to some students, and I listen to how that some of them are being treated, I get so incensed. And then you look further and then you realize that practice isn't a chartered practice. They're not bound. Or maybe actually the partner is not even an architect, but provides architectural services. That is a problem. Until, for me, again, if I was being revolutionary, I will say all firms, no one does any work unless they're getting paid for it. Like I said, if I went to see a solicitor right now and I sat down and said, can I see you for half an hour? They'll start the clock. 15 minutes. Okay, that's 75 quid. 1 hour, that's 250 quid. That's for a low-level briefing session. Because you've spent years acquiring the knowledge. At the end of your first degree, you're going to be, if you're lucky, 30, 40,000 pounds in student debt. By the end of your part 2, part 3, you could almost be 100,000 pounds, right? How does that make my profession accessible to people from non-traditional, socially, economically deprived backgrounds? You're going to go and study accountancy or law, or you're going to go and do medicine because your contract, as soon as you finish with the NHS, we need to look at this again. And part of the work within the RIBA has been trying to push that agenda. I mean, Chris Williamson has just become president of the RIBA. I've had all the time to Chris. I've worked with him on a number of committees, and I'm sure you won't mind me saying, if he's a working class lad, I'm good. Grew up in Derby, no airs and graces, became an architect, set up with his partner. They formed Weston Williamson, and they became successful. But he says that it was the RIBA that gave him the opportunity because he was allowed to present his work 40 under 40, and that's the reason why he's president of the RIBA. He doesn't have to be. He's retired. I know, sorry, Chris, if you're listening to this, I know you're not retired, but he's winding down. He's done well. Yeah. He could just basically go and buy a yacht and, sail around the world till the end of his dying days. But he's president of the RIBA because he wants to ensure that there is an RIBA for you, which is another problem for me. How many students join the RIBA? It's free. Do you join the RIBA to actually get from it so that at some point you can put back into it? A number of students, they complain about the RIBA, but I don't see them as becoming members of the RIBA. I don't see them at 66 Portland Place. I know it's closed for refurbishment at the moment. I don't see them using it. When I was a student, I remember paying £10 to join as a student member for the RIBA. It was the biggest resource that I had. You just pop in there, you remember, you showed your card, you could look at any books, you can actually, get, see people, you could bounce their brains off. I know it's all on the internet, on your phone these days, but actually, the resources of the RIBA should be used. It is accessible to every member, okay? And as a student, you should be using it because ultimately, if you do qualify and become an architect, it's yours. It's not mine. I'm just a custodian, right? I'll be gone in a few years' time. But again, when I hear people complaining about it, and I say, well, have you joined? So why are you complaining? Personally, I'm of the opinion that I would go back to charging students at least £5 to become a member, because at least that way there's a value. A lot of students, those that do, think because it's for free, therefore everything's for free. No, if you join and you're a member, your time isn't free, but then you can get involved. You can try and make change happen. And so whoever's listening to this, if you're not a member of the RIBA, join it. It's free for you as a student, and then you get out of it what you put in. I got involved with the RIBA. I've always been, a student member. I was student of the Students' Association of the Welsh School of Architecture when I was a student. So I've always been quite political. And then when I qualified, I started seeing things. I was a member of the Society of Black Architects for a couple of years and realized that actually to really make change, I need to be in the inside. I've been involved in a number of committees within the RIBA for probably, I've been chartered now for 30 odd years. I've probably been involved for 25 of those years. Okay. Because I want to make a change. And I'm not afraid to raise my head above the parapet. What we see now at the RIBA during my tenure there as Chair of Architects for Change, we had our first inclusion director, diversity and inclusion director, Marshall Ann. That came while I was still chair. We've had our first female CEO of the RIBA in that time, Valerie Von Dick. We've had our first and youngest Black president of the RIBA. Those don't just happen. There's been a lot of committees, a lot of fighting, a lot of shouting, a lot of holding truth, holding power. What's that phrase? Holding truth to power, or to speaking truth to power. Because again, you could be in the room and things are being said, but if there isn't a diverse set of individuals offering advice to the RIBA, and then you're asking that question from your perspective, from your lived experience, oh, maybe we hadn't considered that. That's the reason why you need to get in. As I said, for me, and I supported Muiwa through his presidency. I mean, he's done a good job over the last 2 years. I'm sure he's going to take a bit of time out now just to, to get back to normal. But those things don't happen by accident. They happen by action. For me, being the honorary treasurer, my job slightly, that took me out of the sort of diversity and inclusion aspect. But then it meant that I then had to try and be a critical friend to the executive to ensure that the funds that the RIBA have are not wasted. I have a fiduciary duty as a member, not only as a council member, but also as the honorary treasurer, to ensure that the decisions that are being made are for the betterment of the RIBA, for the longevity of the RIBA. Because on my watch, I'm not taking the business down, right? I've got 18 months left of my tenure as honorary treasurer. Maybe it's even less than that now. But I'm going to make sure that when I hand over the reins to the next honorary treasurer, that he has got something to move forward with, not to try and resolve decisions or bad decisions that I may have made. Yes, it's sometimes actually quite difficult because there are certain things that I personally would like to see happen. But ultimately, and as I've told everyone, I treat RIBA's money as my own. Because if it all goes pear-shaped, they can come for me, they can get my house, right? I'm not prepared to make my wife and children homeless for a poor decision. I and the rest of the trustees, we're there to ensure the RIBA is in a better place after we've left, so that those that come behind us are able to move it forward.
Are you involved in the Albert?
Yes, we are. I am. I'm one of the trailblazer. I represent the practice as one of the trailblazer group. So I am very, very disappointed that level 7 has been scrapped as of January 26. I am very, very disappointed. It was all about creating another pathway to registration to allow those who are not as privileged to find a route in. I know the government is saying actually level 7, by that time, that doesn't deal with what they were trying to do, the agenda of trying to build from the bottom up the whole social mobility. And I get that, because I'm disappointed that there are only 2 universities currently that offer the level 6. That is disappointing to me, because I think that, and I'm only looking at it from my profession, architecture. I know there are other professions that are also feeling this. But if the universities had jumped on board with it, I think for them, they thought it was too difficult. That, how do you manage that? It's interesting how as the universities that had always had a part-time course, they were able to jump onto it a lot easier. South Bank being one, Portsmouth being the other. It upsets me that the universities 10 minutes either side of us, from where I'm sitting now, never adopted it. Does that mean that they saw it as a second-class route to registration? Because if you were able to get the top universities in the land to say, yeah, we're jumping in to this, it's because they couldn't make it work financially. The government didn't support it sufficiently for it to work with the best universities. And the best universities kind of like said, we're oversubscribed. We don't need to do this. If by scrapping level 7 pushes the money to level 6 to allow those a viable route to gain in it, great. What I would personally like the government to consider is that if you start it at level 6, you should be offered the opportunity to take it all the way to level 7 and complete. I've seen that there are those who obviously do the normal first degree and then they think, oh, I'm going to go the apprenticeship route for level 7. That's just, for me, a financially viable pathway to registration. It doesn't really address the social mobility issue. Because for me, if you want to really increase architects from a wider base, you need to attack it at school. You need to attract them at Key Stage 3. You therefore need to try and get them at level 6. And if you can get them at level 6, then you say, right, I'm going to go and become an architect through the apprenticeship route. I'm going to start at level 6. I'm going to get my level 6 equivalent of your part 1 first degree. Then the government should say, right, since you started at level 6, you can continue to level 7.
Mm.
So I think that's what we're going to be lobbying for. That if you started it, that you should be able to progress all the way through. But if you've taken the first degree down the normal route, then you have to self-fund for part 2, or you have to get a firm to sponsor you. Those are my own personal views, whether or not you guys accept it or not. Because if architecture is a profession that I want everyone who aspires to be one can find a route, that to me is a route. I know that when, even though I went down the traditional route towards becoming an architect, I worked through my part. I studied full-time and I worked through my part to be able to afford it. It wasn't easy. If you can imagine holding down a full-time job, doing your part 2 at the same time, but I did it. I didn't have time for anything else, if truth be told. But I wouldn't have wanted it any other way because that was the only way I could have afforded it. Will I wish it on anyone else? No, but if you want it that badly, you will do it. And I'm of the opinion that architecture isn't a job, it's a vocation. You're either called to it or you're not. And if you're called to it, you will find any means to do it. Last week, we held an office tour for some students. And there was one particular student who connected with me. And he was part-time restaurant manager, full-time architecture student. I take my hat off to him. In fact, one of the architects who I interviewed and employed was working full-time in the restaurant and studying architecture and got a first. And when I was asked why did I employ him, I said, if a guy is so determined to become an architect that he's prepared to work full-time and study, and he's able to do them both, because the great thing is that when you are time-starved, your mind goes into overdrive. Procrastination doesn't come into your vocabulary. Get in, you do it. You're able to, your mind is working. And there are times in our profession when you're pressured, when you've grown up or you've had to work hard to get to where you are, you're able to really switch on your mind. Don't get me wrong. If you're privileged enough, your parents are paying for you, you've got a lovely apartment or you're being government sponsored, great. Happy for you. But if you've got a graft, I'm a grafter, right? And maybe I endear myself to people who graft because I know that, as I said before, architecture is a contact sport, it's a team sport. I'm a former rugby player. I can't do everything, just like in the game of rugby. One man cannot win the game. So getting people who have had, I won't say had it hard, but I've had to work hard for it makes you a stronger person. And again, when I should we get a bit personal now? So my father died when I was 6 years old. He got ill. He'd studied and we were supposed to finish. We were going back to Nigeria. Even though I was born here, we were going back to Nigeria. A big job. Everything was going to be cool. I was going to a private school, everything. Get to Nigeria. 6 months later, he dies. He was 34, right? I was 6. My mother became a widow with myself and my 2 sisters. My younger sister was 9 months old at the time. My mother made the decision to sell everything in Nigeria and bring us back to this country. Start again. My mother sacrificed her life for us. Okay. I became an architect. My sister is a solicitor and a law lecturer. And my other sister now is a teacher. I remember what she went through. I remember the number of jobs that she did. And she always said, there's no such thing as free lunch. No one's going to give you anything in this world. If you want it, you go and do it. So when I was going through my architectural journey, the thing that kept me going on was the fact that I had a role model in the hard work that my mother did to provide for us. It was me. And maybe that's probably that's probably now why I have that outlook. It's not going to be easy for students. It's not easy for Black students. Okay? It isn't. Okay? I went, in my course, in my year, there was me, and there was another Kenyan born architect. And by the time I got my first degree, I was the only Black guy who graduated that year. Okay? But For me, it's no, I didn't see that as any, my school was the only black kid in the class. So I never had this, oh my God, I'm a minority. My mother always just used to say, I don't care what you are, whether you're white, green, black, you need to be in the top 5%. That's it, Oh, mum, this has happened. Yeah, and you want to know what it's like when I came here in the 60s. I won't tell you, maybe off camera I can tell you some of the stories that she told us. And some of the racism that she had to address in her work life. And she was of the opinion, deal with it, get over it, confront it, deal with it. I'm sure you see, I've gone on record quite a few times of never letting any minor aggressions slip. I do that for myself more than anything else, and for people like you. I don't let any jokes slip. No banter, no nothing. If there's anything that even slightly is a bit of a microaggression, I'm not. Maybe that's because of the hard skin, and maybe because I know where I'm strong within myself, because I feel that if I can't do it, what hope have you guys got? I've got to, in the stage of my career now, I've got to make sure that you guys are confident enough to deal with it, and to know that you can't just take it in and just treat things as banter or microaggressions. I've got all my 4 children in exactly the same way. My mother used to say to me, I'm never coming to school for anything, so don't get in trouble. But if someone abuses you, 2 things must happen. If someone hits you, you hit them back. If you come home and tell me that someone hit you and you didn't hit them, I will hit you myself. Start off at 10. I was more scared of my mother. But interestingly, in that time at school, I was only really involved in one fight because a guy was bullying me. And I just always remembered what my mother said. And I hit back. And I hit back with such ferocity. No one ever troubled me. And I've said that to my children. My wife thinks that I shouldn't. But they've never had a problem at school. Okay? So that's the first thing. And then secondly, being able to stand up, irrespective of what the outcome's going to be, is better for you. Never to come away and say, oh, I should have done that. I should have stood up. I should have said this. That eats you up inside. Yeah, you've got to have confidence in yourself, and people will respect you for it. Because if you don't grab that respect, people will take it.
Yeah.
And I accept the fact that I'm a jovial person. So my line to you guys is, be proud of what you are. Be proud of who you are, where you've come from, because that is your strength.
What would you consider?
By the way, you didn't have Francis Kerry there, but it's okay.
Maybe next time. What would you say is an unpopular or challenging opinion you have about architecture?
The unpopular opinion is that people think that architecture is for free, that design is for free, and it isn't, because ultimately it is a business. It's a part of the creative industry. We are a business, okay? For us to be able to, and maybe that's with some I won't say some clients, but there are members of society that seem to think that what we do is, quite ethereal. Architecture is where art and science meets. You therefore need to have developed a level of knowledge in order to be able to practice it. That level of knowledge, that level of investment that you put into the study of architecture has to be rewarded. I know there's a lot of news at the present moment. The Sterling Awards are in a couple of days' time. We're going to be celebrating what we consider to be the best of architecture over the last year, which is great. But what about the rest of it? What about being able to ensure that we don't lose people halfway through the process, that you can see that when you get your part 1 or when you get your part 2, that you can apply for a job and that you can be properly compensated. That you not only hit the living wage, but that you're being paid. I remember my sister, my baby sister at that, when she became a qualified solicitor, in her first 5 years of working, she was already earning more than me, and I'd been practicing for 10 years. And that's being a lawyer. So there's something wrong with my profession that you take 7 years minimum to qualify. As I said, it took me 9. and then you come out and you're not being properly rewarded. There's something wrong in that structure. But it's down to us. We need to ensure, and I'm not asking for a cartel, by the way. I'm not saying that, I quite like the old fee scales that were abolished in 97. At least that way, there was a level playing field. Architects weren't, involved in a race to the bottom on fees. Until we get the fee situation sorted, architecture will no longer become a profession that people of any means can do. Because you'll be looking at it and you'll be saying, I can't afford it. I want to become an architect, but actually maybe I'll just become a graphic designer. I can come out, or worse still, I'll become a lawyer. I'll share one story with you. I remember being at a dinner party once, and I was with a very good friend of mine who was an engineer. He was really, really annoyed with the architect he was working with. And I kind of said, why? He said, well, we're working for the same client. And I said to this client, this developer client, that if he wants my input, he's going to have to pay. And the client said, okay, fine. He said, but to my amazement, the architect was working for free in the hope that they won the project, and that's when he was going to get his money, which basically meant that he wasn't able to start the project properly because it was something on the side. We don't work for free. Yes, we may take part in some competitions. A big competition, there has to be a paid competition. Know thy value. In the same way that I made a decision to leave because they weren't respecting and rewarding me properly. The same way where I wouldn't take a project if a client says to me, brother, I'd like you to work up this scheme, but I'm not going to pay you. I'm only going to pay you if we get selected. No, we're in the business of adding value to a client's building, a client's plan, a client's dreams. You've got to pay for it. I don't mind saying that I'm prepared to offset the profit in the event of success, but I'm not going to offer the labor for free. Because if I have to offer the labor for free, then I'm looking for people to work for free. Okay. So, there is a knock-on effect. We need to wrestle that, and we need to deal with it now. Otherwise, only privileged individuals will go on to become architects. We won't get, people who would love to be architects but can't afford it. As I said, I worked through my part too. To get to where I was. Can you do that nowadays? The cost of living is through the roof. But I am optimistic because I'm expecting, I think the current generation of students are realizing that they're the ones that need to make the change. And as I say, not accepting to work for anyone that's not going to pay you, which therefore means that the firms then have to think about their fee structures, which then they then have to have that conversation with the client, and the client will have to say, well, if I need you, we will have to pay. Because the clients, they don't want to share the profit. When they've made those millions of pounds of profit, they don't want to share it with you. Some clients do, don't get me wrong, but most of them, they're like, we've paid for the service, or worse still, you get a situation where a client will come to a big firm to get a project through planning. And then once it gets through planning, we'll then go and give it to a smaller firm to develop at half the fees. That to me isn't right. It's business, but it isn't right. We need to find a way of tying up those ends. We need to ensure that the copyright of our work, in the same way as a musician has a copyright, if they're clever enough, of not only the song that they're singing, but the words they've written and the scores they've written, to ensure that they get earnings.
Or even in football, when there's a sell-on clause, like if you're taking the work away, we should get, 10% of whatever the profit.
Yeah, there's a sell-on. Exactly. We need to be slightly more business savvy, okay? I'm not going to bore you with the phrase. One of my favorite phrases, I came from an interview from James Brown many years ago. I remember watching it and it stuck in my head. Someone said to me, you're a very successful musician. Why is that? And he said, well, you see, because I'm in the show business. Well, yeah, we know that. He says, yeah, but that's 25% show, 75% business. So, yeah, unless we do this right, the show will go on, right? We cannot operate as architects unless we get the business structures right.